Okay. Okay. So first question, what are your memories inside the Fine Arts Library?
A lot of my memories have to do with researching for papers and going in there looking for specific books, but also a lot of the times, my memories are a lot of the times going in there with an open-ended, not looking for anything in particular, and looking for just kind of general knowledge. And so a lot of my memories are leaving the library with a giant stack of books that I never read. And I also remember using the copier a lot. Like, that is particularly something I used a lot. And so a lot of my memories are just kind of going through the stacks and looking at things and looking for either something specific or nothing in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Both ends.
So I've had a lot of artists talk about that they went in looking for something and not really knowing what they were going to find. How do you see that process play out in your practice or in your work about looking but going down a whole different path than you thought you were going to?
I mean, I think that's like every artistic practice, but particularly like using objects, I do that a lot. So I'll pick up an object and I'll try and transform it in a way in which I think it's going to be very deliberately transformed in this way, and then I end up doing something 100% different. And in, like, just in practice, like mark making wise.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about using the copier, and you're going and you're looking for knowledge. So, do you see any connection between copies, or you can think of, artifacts as things holding something bigger to that knowledge that you're looking for, like almost, they're copies of the original, but they're there to help you access something. So how do you think that in your work, copies, I mean, you're a printmaker, so the idea of copying to maybe get closer to that original idea or like a really deep knowledge base?
Yeah. Not to sound pretentious, I think there's a little bit of Lacanian like absence of the object when you make a copy, and but copies are also great for dissemination of information. So I think of like the copy as a way to give broad access, but you're still like, there's an absence of what that object is, whether that's a copy of two-dimensional like paper documentation or documentation of an actual object. So like I've been thinking a lot about fiber work, like kimonos as display, like just in a particular example, displaying this object in homes as like a ancestral memory, this object, and then often there's like a copy of that kimono made, or images documenting that kimono shown in museums or in textbooks. And I think like there's that, you get the sense of the object, but you don't get the sense of the memory tied to the object.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue because memories and something you've been really interested in. And so do you want to talk about first just like, what do you think, just memory, just the big M, what do you kind of think about that?
I have lots of thoughts about memories. I think a lot about nostalgia tied to memory, because memory is an ever-shifting thing and it's not a constant. Like in social psychology and evolutionary psychology terms, when we remember, we're revisiting the memory and remaking the memory every single time. So it's again like a copy, a distorted like copy of the original. And nostalgia tinges that a lot. Or like the anti-nostalgia, I guess, like when we look at our memory with certain emotions, like it re-changes the memory to where it is now. And so I think a lot about memory as ways to interpret the present and how we interpret the past through present lens.
Definitely. This show in particular, I've asked for memories because for me, I have memories of watching you guys, and I was always really interested in how your time there, how it got interpreted or disseminated into your work, and so I became interested in gathering memory as an actual way for you guys to reinterpret space, so you could go in and when you installed or when you put your work in, that you would have these reinterpretations. So how do you feel about that?
With my work, particularly going into the space.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I think it canonizes my work as like as historical artifacts and memories, but also like, I guess on a really personal level, libraries are very important to me. My mom worked in a library. Like, I grew up in a library. Libraries, I'm a kid of the 90s. Everybody went to the library every weekend. And then I worked in a library for 2.5 years. So, like, there's a lot of memory personally tied to library, but also, like, my work becomes an artifact. My work is remembering the space in which I'm trying to, like, word this as best I can. A lot of these objects are created using, like, very recent memory looking on long-term past memory. So I'm reinterpreting a memory of a memory. And that's kind of interesting, going back into that space, reinterpreting the memory.
Yeah, and you can think about, I mean, one thing that's interesting is that's a special collection library for artists and musicians, and a lot of those resources are reinterpretations of things that happened in the past. And so how do you feel about a space that's for, you're a part of the artistic community. How do you feel about collections that are there for you to access, this canon of, what's the word I'm trying to say? Sorry. Okay, so basically it's like you now have access to these, all these different interpretations and all these different resources. So by having, how do you feel about having access to those resources? How do you feel that it, can you think of any specific memories where those resources affected your artwork or your art practice?
Yeah, I mean, in a variety, I'm trying to, like, pinpoint one that's really interesting, but, I mean, how do I feel about it? I feel it's great. Like, as an artist practicing in Oklahoma, there are, outside of the Fine Arts Library at OU, there are very few collections in which I can access, like, specific documents that I need. But in my practice at OU, I remember looking through the printmaking books and finding people. Particularly, I was interested in printmaking as democracy. Like, again, like copying, disseminating information, and there were lots of really great texts on that. And so that really influenced my practice as both a curator and a art maker.
And switching gears just a bit, let's talk about your specific pieces about gathering artifacts from communities, and what power do you see in whenever you ask for objects that hold memories and then putting them back on display? How does that? What kind of effect do you think that has?
So I haven't actually done that yet, which is something I'm really interested in doing. But I feel and there's, like, I'm a little reticent to dive into that because of the power.
Yeah.
And, like, the reinterpretation of other people's objects. Like, so I am reinterpreting my own objects, or while I am taking other people's objects, I'm taking my family's objects that were never mine and reinterpreting them. And there's a power, since those people are no longer here, I can reinterpret that without their consent. But taking other people's objects and putting them on display feels a little like appropriation of someone else's memories, and so I'm
definitely. I think there's
trouble with that.
No. I mean, I think a little of that might have been my wording, but that's I think what you're picking up on is the power that comes with access, and so there's and what I having multiple voices. That represent the object is important, and so I guess let's go back. Let's talk about your work where you use artifacts, and let's why don't you explain that just a bit?
Okay, yeah. So my first foray into that was a self-portrait made of objects from my and my family's past. So Polaroids, documentation, mostly documentation of my life through ephemera, and then I started realizing, like, the things that make a portrait of someone, or like a portrait of a memory. And so I've started taking good examples are fanny pack, like a box for jewelry, and taking those and transforming them with fiber. So often embroidery, weaving, like loose weaving, of making webs in these objects, lots of embroidery, and using nature motifs on those objects that are often tied to memory.
And I think that's, my interpretation of that's really interesting, because you look at the way, we have different, memory can mean a lot of different things. There's biological memory, there's the way that cells, know how to form certain ways. There's, spiders know how to make their webs certain ways. There's computer memory. There's a way that a computer does that. And then there's human memory. And so the way to, I think that it's, really, I'm just, for me, I still don't know what memory is. I don't understand it,
Yeah.
And so I think, trying to, with the fiber, is it, because when I think of fiber, I think of there's a temporal element to it, because it actually took that time to make those stitches or to make that knot, but then it's also like it's literally showing that process in itself. It's a temporal thing onto itself. And so do you feel like the fiber elements help? Are you forming connections or bonds, or how do you feel whenever you, and taking these ephemeral objects and doing some sort of combining the fiber with it? What do you usually think about while you're doing that?
A little literal interpretation of fiber as like a connector, as like a thing that ties literally things together as well as metaphorically. A lot of people interpret it through kind of a feminist lens, with embroidery being a woman's craft and weaving and knitting. I don't have that history. Like, that's not a history that I share. So. But I think it does. A lot of my objects are from women, so I think it's like there's a little bit of that. But the fiber itself, I like the process being shown, and it's like a very hand done element, and I think it's literally a labor of love. So yeah, I could talk in cliches, but
I think one question too I have, where it's maybe showing a little bit more of a connection between a library and your work, is how do you feel about the difference between collections and curation? Have you thought about that much? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when I first started looking into curation, I looked at curators of library spaces and how I didn't see that being a curator. I don't know. Like, I'm thinking about it. Let me mull.
It's a big question for me too.
Yeah, it's a question that I think about, and I don't know how to answer that.
I've had I interviewed. I'm trying not to get this way too off topic. This has been something I dropped that in the middle of Amy's interview, and she's like, and I was like, wait, just forget I just said that. But I think one thing is, how do you pull those whenever I'm thinking of your piece in general, which is the one with the jewelry box and what we've just been talking about. How do you pull those objects together? How do you decide that these are the objects that I want to present?
Yeah, okay. Therein lies the difference between curation and collection. I think if I were just collecting those objects, I would have literally used the objects that were found in that jewelry box. None of those objects were found in that jewelry box. Instead, I picked objects tied to memory and that fit like the general theme of essence. I don't want to like tie any words to it, because I think that would take too much literal interpretation of objects. And for me, my work is a lot about using my own personal memory to hopefully connect to other people's personal memories without being way too literal. It's mine, but at the same time, other people can interpret it how they wish. Which is totally whatever. But I feel like maybe I'm a little bit too up on a high horse thinking that everyone's going to take something personal away from it. But instead of just collecting things, I picked things that had a similar affect, a similar essence, and a similar like metaphysical property that could be in this web signifying some transition of time.
I picked up on that a lot looking at photographs of your work, and I actually narrowed in a lot on the materiality, because you had things like bone, like biological things, and then you also had things that made it very obvious that there was obvious synthetics as well. And so using, it's not, your works are not time-based per se, like in a strict sense, but they very much denote time passing. I feel like I get a lot of that. I don't want to get too much into metaphysics because I'll get out of my thing, but I think there's something kind of unexplainable when you have objects that you can feel their time. And I think, I've been really careful not to use the word nostalgia in any of my statements and in any of my, because I see nostalgia as something different than memory. And I think you placed it quite well, but do you maybe want to kind of talk again a little bit more about your exploration into nostalgia and how you view it with memory, kind of where you draw?
I tie them a lot together, even though I think of them as very separate. And I don't say this in my statements ever, but I think of nostalgia as dangerous. Like, I think it's a very dangerous thing. And I'm interested in nostalgia as a negative nostalgia, like I don't know if we have a word for it in English, and I'm sure there is one, but looking at things in the past and wistfully and sadly at the same time, like missing those very sad moments. And I mean, nostalgia does evoke some of that, but I think nostalgia is like longing for that time, but this is like a non-longing and like re-remembering wistfully. And so I'm interested in how memory and how people reinterpret memories, how we reinterpret our past. Nostalgia, though, like, personally trying to be nostalgic about things without getting caught up in wistfulness or even objectiveness. Like, trying to be non-objective. And maybe a little bit more subjective.
Definitely. I think one thing that's I'm thinking about right now is, I think when we think of libraries, we think of very textual records. We think of books, and we think of those books as collections of texts or manuscripts or something that's there to give us knowledge. But I think one thing, how do you feel about collections or libraries? And do you feel like that the Fine Arts Library ever held something more for you than just textual knowledge? Do you feel like you were ever in a space did you feel like that space gave you, just having access to that space, did you feel like you were able to, by having access to...
Is there a resource that outside of the textual?
Yeah. Is there some, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's like, I'm going to get into a lot of like, the way that the light was there, the way like that point in your life, like there's a huge nostalgia element to this. I feel this when I think of my early days before I worked there.
I think a lot of like memories of libraries are incredibly nostalgic. Yeah. When I think of the Fine Arts Library, like even just talking about it, I get like this kind of like fluttering in my chest. Yeah. Which is simultaneously like remember the anxiety I'd sometimes have in the library and like this incredible excitement for something else. I remember often going there on a Saturday morning and just hanging out, and it was kind of like my time away from work. I'd go there on breaks from work. I'd go there in between classes. It was always like a resource of space away from the spaces I inhabited most of the time. It was my fourth space as opposed to third space. The first two spaces being home and work, and then the third.
No, definitely.
You know what I mean?
No, I know.
Where do we inhabit our spaces? That was my fourth space. And, lots of memories of just being excited.
I felt as a young artist being in there, I felt like that space gave me something that I didn't have at the school. Because I didn't want it at the school, I felt like I was by seeing all of these other artists on these shelves and having access to all the material and being in a space where it was a time for me to access that knowledge, I felt like I was somehow fulfilling myself as being a better artist. Like this made me feel, it helped me build my confidence. And so there was something there. When I think back, I have specific color tones and palettes and times of year where it was like, that's where I trained myself. And so how do you, feel as that the library was a space for you to grow individually, even though it is a curated space. It was, somebody planned those collections, but just by having access to them, you were able to do something. Your art was able. Do you feel like your art was able to benefit? I'm sorry, I'm trying not to talk too much for you. I'm trying to set you up for when you can talk. Your last answer was great. It's maybe I'm spending too much time on this. I can't think of anything. Is there anything else that you, just on this subject of memory and collection and record and access to those, do you feel like you have anything else that you think about?
Like one element that I have a hard time like materializing into words to bring these two concepts together is community, and like how community access to memory, and collective memory, and record keeping. Like I think of our record keeping now as very highly personal, and how does that relate to the community when in times past there was always collective memory and like there were individual memories for sure, but I'm thinking particularly of Plains Indians and familial record keeping and tribal record keeping, clan record keeping, like how those broader records tied into both personal narrative and communal narrative, and how right now with blogs and vlogs and like individual artistic practice being its own form of individual art record keeping, how does that relate to a communal record keeping? How will it look as a communal record keeping in 200 years? I'm interested in how personal memory ties to the community.
I think that
they're two really broad subjects, but
I think that's a good place to end with your question.